Hello and welcome to this revision podcast on Renaissance medicine. Renaissance is a period that lasted from about 1450 to 1750, and sometimes it's called early modern medicine. But it's called Renaissance as well because it means rebirth, and French for rebirth is Renaissance. And it's called rebirth because this is a time when Western civilization changed lots and there was a rebirth of learning. They studied old books from the ancients and realised that the Romans and the Greeks knew a lot better than them and a lot more than them in some areas. There were new translations made of Galen and Hippocrates, and so people realised the point of the Greeks was that they liked experimenting, not just accepting what they were told. In Renaissance time, the governments were strong. Think Henry VIII, and there was lots of trade between countries, and therefore there was lots of wealth. Many people could afford doctors. Artists like Da Vinci drew more accurate anatomy, and doctors actually used his drawings before starting an operation. And Da Vinci could draw so accurately because he dissected real humans. Universities established schools of medicine at this point as well. There was the beginning of scientific methods which led to questioning of ancient ideas such as the ones of Galen and Hippocrates. This scientific method meant experimenting, observing these experiments, and then coming to a conclusion or a hypothesis. The Royal Society was set up at this time by a group of men who were interested in discussing scientific techniques and scientific areas, including medicine. It published books and demonstrated experiments in its own facilities as it had laboratories, and this spread lots of new ideas. It got a royal charter in 1662 which actually protected them from accusations that they might be terrorists after the Restoration. Also, the printing press led to a spread of new and old ideas because books were now cheaper than ever before and much easier to publish in large numbers instead of getting a monk to write it all out for you. There was new food and medicine brought back from the newly discovered America. For example, quinine was a cure for malaria. There's also new weapons at this time, particularly guns, which led to all new injuries and therefore improved surgery on those injuries. However, many people at this time rejected new ideas, and that's primarily because of the church, and primarily the Catholic Church. Also, these new ideas didn't actually help doctors find better cures for most of the time because germs were still not understood and germ theory hadn't been proven. Anatomy was developed quite a lot. One person who was famous for doing that was Vesalius. He was a dwarf who trained at many universities, including the famous Padua. He stole bodies to dissect them, and he figured out by doing this that Galen was wrong. For example, Galen said that there were 2 bones in the jaw. Wrong. Galen was also wrong about how muscles were joined to the bone, and how blood passes through the heart, because it doesn't. There's no invisible little holes in the septum. But Galen said there was. Vesalius proved him wrong. Vesalius also proved that men and women had the same number of ribs. The church had always taught that God had taken a rib from Adam to make Eve, and women were part of men, were taken from Adam's rib. So by saying that they had the same amount of ribs, Vesalius was making a mockery of the Bible. But he was right. And he wrote a book called The Fabric of the Human Body, which had high quality drawings, and he told his medical students to dissect bodies. And many other doctors copied his scientific attitude. Another doctor that used this scientific attitude was William Harvey. He was doctor to both James I and his son Charles I. He also studied at Padua, and his big discovery is that he proved the blood circulated around the body in arteries and veins, and it was pumped by the heart. He proved it by scientific and methodical means, and he cut up a lot of frogs. He also pushed out rods down the veins of dead people to prove that there are valves that mean the blood can only go one way in the vein, meaning that it must circulate. This proved Galen wrong as well, because Galen said that blood was produced in the liver and used up in the muscles like fuel. So this also implied that the full humus theory was incorrect. However, his patients thought he was crazy and some left his practice. Without this discovery, we couldn't do blood transfusions or internal surgery, but at the time it didn't make any difference to medicine. People needed to understand infection and blood groups, etc., before these discoveries would be any use. Also, he didn't understand everything. He didn't know about the capillaries that moved the blood from arteries to veins. Paracelsus is someone else who criticised Galen, and he actually burnt Galen's books before the start of his lectures to prove a point, although he did still believe in the four humours. Paracelsus discovered laudanum, which is a kind of opium, and he used it as a fairly successful painkiller. In the Renaissance period, Anton van Leeuwenhoek discovered bacteria, although he didn't realise its significance, and that was obviously left till 1861, and germ theory with Louis Pasteur. Doctors at the time did realise that the plague was contagious, but they couldn't do anything to stop it in 1665, in the Great Plague of London. The results, therefore, hadn't really changed since the 1349 Black Death epidemic throughout Britain. There were still some similar herbal remedies and potions that were used, and most of them were a bit crazy. Many people still believe the same wrong theories about the causes and treatment of disease as they did in the Middle Ages. Doctors in towns were well educated and trained, they did scientific experiments and spread their knowledge, but they had limited success, and most people couldn't afford them anyway. King Charles II could afford the best doctors, but they couldn't cure him of his kidney disease, mainly because they didn't know it was kidney disease. And they bled him, which is probably the worst thing you can do for kidney disease, and it killed him. Ordinary people had to settle for poorly trained, cheap country doctors, or apothecaries, barber surgeons, wise women, also known as witches, or even quacks. Quacks who would sell them meaningless artifacts that wouldn't get them better at all. Paré was a barber surgeon, and he was a barber surgeon for 20 years working for the French army. He discovered that wounds healed better with a potion of egg yolks, oil of roses and turpentine, and he'd remembered this from the books he'd read on Roman times. He also used catgut ligatures to tie arteries during amputation, and both of these remedies replaced cauterization or boiling oil. Women started at this point going to hospitals to have babies, and this reduced the role of women as midwives. Giving birth was still very dangerous, even more so as new equipment called forceps, which was supposed to help and often didn't, had been invented. They were dirty and only ever used by men, as women didn't understand the body enough apparently. And women weren't allowed to train as physicians, so they wouldn't have known that, although they could actually become barber surgeons. Women did most of the medicine at home. For example, Lady Grace Mildmay looked after all the people on her husband's estate. Nicholas Culpeper wrote a book on herbal remedies, some of which worked, but he still used opposites, and he recommended smoking tobacco. Jenner discovered cowpox, and he discovered cowpox prevented you from getting smallpox, but he didn't know why, so it didn't actually improve medicine as a whole. In public health, Renaissance towns were very similar to medieval towns. They were rat and lice infested, with poo in the streets. There were no sewers or water pipes, and the floors in the houses were covered with rushes, which is obviously dirty. When Henry VIII closed down the monasteries, many of the hospitals actually disappeared. Some councils took them over, for example St Bartholomew's or St Bart's in London. New, less religious hospitals were set up, paid for by the town councils, local people and even charities. But they only looked after poor people. Rich people would stay at home and get a doctor to come to them. People with infectious diseases were turned away. Treatment was free, but you had to pray, not pay. St Bart's had three doctors who are also known as physicians, and 3 surgeons. Nurses weren't trained at all. During the Great Plague of London in 1665, some laws were introduced to try and combat it. There were surgeons appointed to inspect the dead, searchers locked you in your house if you got it, constables made sure you stayed in there if you got it, and stray pigs, dogs and cats were ordered to be killed, and they were killed, which ironically actually made it worse by allowing more rats which had the fleas on them, which actually caused it, so it made it worse. And actually plague only ended when weather turned cold. That's what killed it off. So that's the information on the medical renaissance. Tune in next time for another revision podcast on the Industrial Revolution and its medicine.